Former CEO of drugstore.com. She has sat on the boards of eBay, Walmart, the New York Times, and most recently joined the board of Real Network. So this is somebody that knows board formation backwards and forwards. She's also a startup advisor and investor, and so I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage Dawn Lepore.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. I have been both a CEO and a board member, but one of the things I love to do is I love to build companies. And it's so much fun to do it both as a CEO and on board. So this is an area that's kind of near and dear to my heart. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is common sense, but I think sometimes when you're in the midst of starting a company, and we've heard so much about all the pressures that are on you as an entrepreneur, you can kind of forget some of the common sense things. Obviously, boards have a governance role. I'm not trying to minimize that, but I think the most important role that boards play is to help the company and most importantly the CEO, founder CEO or the CEO, be very successful. So it's not exactly a marriage. There's been a lot of metaphors up here about marriage and relationships, but the board and the CEO relationship is a very important relationship. What you need to remember when you're building your board is the people who are on your board will have an impact on your day-to-day life, and they're going to have an impact on the vision that you have. So you really need to think carefully as you build that board. They can simplify your job, make your job much easier, make you feel supported, or it can really complicate your job if the board isn't working right, or you don't have the right people or the right skills or the right kind of feeling on the board. It can be a great partnership, and it also can help you be successful. In some ways, you've got built-in mentors on your board. If you choose your board members right, you've got built-in teachers, mentors, supporters, people to challenge you, support you, ask you tough questions. And the thing is that boards matter a lot when things get bumpy. I'm going to talk about a few examples that I've had over my career, both as a CEO and a board member. But things are easy. When everything's up and to the right and you're blowing through your numbers, things are easy and they're easy for the board. But when things get tough, or you have to pivot, or you have to make some of the tough decisions that TA talked about, your board really, really matters. I think too many CEOs just let the board happen, right? I really think this is as important as building out your exec team, especially if you haven't been on a lot of boards or worked with a lot of boards. So maybe you're a first-time entrepreneur, a first-time CEO, so you don't have quite as much context about boards. It's really important that you take a step back and think about it strategically. So what are your strengths? What are your team's strengths? What do you need to balance that out? Do you need some big names in a particular area, or do you need a certain amount of experience? You really need to think about it very strategically. What my own advice is don't be trapped into using board seats as currency. Sometimes people, especially if your company's doing well, you want to reward a friend or a friend of a friend, or there's somebody in a circle, and you kind of use your board seat as currency. That can really backfire on you, so you want to be really, really careful about that. I would also say don't just use your own network or your investors' network just for recruiting. Think a little more broadly. If you do think strategically, if you go back and say, what are the skills that I need, then I'm not saying you have to use a search person. Absolutely, there are lots of ways to network and find great board members, but don't necessarily just use your own network, because sometimes that can be it can be closed. It can be people who maybe already think the way you do, or already have your same experiences, so it's not necessarily broad enough. And I say to be careful of the prestige trap. I've had experiences on boards where you either take money from an investor or because you want this big name person on your board. If that person doesn't have passion about your company, if there's not a values connection, there's a lot of reasons why sometimes adding a prestigious name can be helpful to a board, but it also can be a real trap. So think about it very, very carefully. This is a long-term relationship most of the time. It's difficult to swap out board members, so you really need to be thoughtful before you add somebody to the board. So here's my take on what makes a great board member. You guys can add your own thoughts to this list as well. I think one of the most important things is to have somebody who's very emotionally committed to your company and your vision. I just think if somebody's going to be a great board member, they need to share the vision. They need to share the passion for what you're building. Values matter. I'm going to talk a lot more about values. You have to have an alignment on values. TA talked about finding the investors that have aligned values. I think that's really important on the board as well. Once again, I'm not saying everybody should be the same. You want different points of view, you want different ways people think, but you do need to be aligned on some basic values. I think courage is important. You want people who are going to ask you tough questions, who are going to do it in a supportive way. They're going to be confrontive in a supportive way, but they're going to ask you the tough questions. They're not just going to sit and nod their head. They're going to prepare for the board meetings. They're really going to think. They're going to make you be the best CEO and executive you can possibly be. When I interviewed for the Walmart board, Rob Walton asked me, I think, one of the best questions I've ever been asked in an interview for a board. He looked at me and said, "Are you confident enough to not talk?" He said, there are so many boards where people just want to hear themselves talk, and whether they have something good to say or not, they speak up. So are you confident enough to know when to keep your mouth shut, when maybe you don't need to weigh in, or when you're not going to move the conversation forward? I think that's important. We certainly talked about skills and experience. You want that, you want to think about what you need on the board. Obviously, you want people who are invested in your success. Time is important as well, and by that I don't mean that you should only hire people who have lots and lots of time. You know how much time you want, and you're going to have a portfolio on your board, so some people may have more time, some people may have less time, some people may be in operating jobs, some people not. Just be thoughtful about how much time you want, and it's good to have an explicit conversation with people who are going on your board about what your expectations are. And my own view is that you need at least one person on the board who's walked in your shoes. So especially if you're a CEO, you're an operator, and you have all investors on your board, they add huge value. Of course, they have a great perspective, they've invested money in your company, they have great contacts. But when I joined the drugstore board, I had almost all investors on my board. I had a fabulous board, by the way. But there was nobody on the board who'd been a CEO, who walked in my shoes. When I was sitting talking about issues I had with culture, issues I had with employees, there wasn't anybody else who'd actually been a CEO. And I went out and recruited somebody who was a sitting CEO, and it just added a richness to the conversation that was very, very helpful to me. I mentioned values. Values really, really do matter, and you've heard a lot about that this morning. But it's interesting, I'm talking to a very small startup company now about joining their board, and this entrepreneur is going to add their first independent board member, and he said to me, I have a dream here. I have a big, big vision. I've had lots of people tell me that I should focus, grow fast, and then monetize it quickly. But that's not what I want to do. I want to change the world. So if you don't feel passionate about changing the world with me, then this isn't going to be a good fit. It's not going to be a good marriage. So those kind of conversations are really important. So do you want to focus, or do you want a broad vision? Are you trying to change the world, or are you trying to hit a double? By the way, there's nothing good or bad. Everybody is in a different spot when they start a company, or what they want from that particular experience. Do you want to self-fund versus do you want to take institutional money? That's a big decision. You've heard about that. Once again, I've had entrepreneurs say to me, I don't want to take any institutional money. I want to self-fund for a while. That means I'm going to grow a little slower. So if you're not comfortable with that, maybe that's not a good fit for us. Now, once again, it doesn't mean that things aren't going to change and the thought process of the entrepreneur isn't going to change over time, but it's important to at least have those conversations. How do you feel about employee ownership versus dilution? I've been on boards where there are certain board members who don't want to give any stock to employees. They just feel like they've been overly diluted. That's fine. I understand their point of view. But the CEO is very, very committed to having ownership throughout their company. That's a kind of values conflict that's very difficult to bridge, and it just leads to a lot of cycles spent on making decisions. You want somebody who can challenge you constructively, who you know supports you but can challenge you, who believes in you but is going to really challenge you and ask the tough questions. And you also want somebody who's been through the ups and downs. As I said, being a board member is fun, and it's always fun, in my opinion, but it's easy when everything's up and to the right, but it gets more challenging when there's ups and downs. You want somebody who knows how to handle those ups and downs. So I think boards at their best, it's a wonderful experience. As a CEO, it's great. As a board member, it's great. It can be a really safe place to ask for advice. If you're stuck, if you've lost perspective, somebody has I keep saying this tough questions, but you really want to make sure that you don't have yes people on your board, that you have people who are going to challenge your thinking, because it'll make you a much better CEO. Also, emotional support. You know, there were lots of times, Drugstore was a tough company to run, competing with Amazon. We had low margins, we were public, we were small, it was hard to get coverage. There were times when I was just having lots of bad days, and it was really nice to be able to pick up the phone and say to a board member, I'm having a really tough day or a really tough week. Can we just talk about it? Or can you help me remember why I'm doing this? Sometimes you just need that kind of conversation. You also need the right life structure for the life cycle of the company. When I was running Drugstore, I had an investor who I really, really respected. And he had this person he really wanted me to put on the board. And I interviewed her, and she was a governance expert. And she was quite renowned. She had published. She was quite thoughtful. She was a very smart woman. But I knew that for what a Drugstore was, we didn't need governance. Our governance was fine. We needed to figure out how to grow the margins, how to grow the revenue, how to keep Amazon from eating us, talking about the bear analogy. And so it wasn't the right time to add a governance person to the board. So you need to think about where you are in the life cycle of your company. And it's also, I think, a great developmental experience for your team. If you bring your executives into the board meeting and they get to hear what questions board members ask, how they think, I learned so much coming up in my career from being on boards or sitting into the board meetings at Schwab, where I worked for 21 years. It was just, it was so wonderful to see how people thought. So it can be a great developmental experience for your team. There are boards at their worst, though, and I just wanted to talk about a few anecdotes just so you can think about them and just pay attention as you're building your own board. I don't know what the right size is. It depends on companies, but for an early company, a big board is a real challenge. It's a challenge to get everybody in the room. I would say beware of observer seats. I was on a board where there were like 8 observer seats. Every time I had a board meeting, I mean, it was standing room only in the boardroom. I mean, it was ridiculous because I couldn't get anything done, and you had people who were voters and people who were observers. It was very hard to keep track of. The other thing is, if you've done a lot of rounds, you can end up with a board where the economic interests aren't aligned, right? And maybe people have joined the board or invested at different valuations, so when an offer comes in to sell the company or you're doing something, I mean, everybody has a different interest. It's very, very difficult if you don't have alignment of economic interests. So it's just something to really think about, especially if you've had to do a down round or there's those kind of things going on in the history of your company. I've also been on boards where, going back to the watch out for the prestige kind of board member, where there was an entrepreneur who really wanted a particular venture capital firm to invest in their company. That's great. They had a very high profile partner. And by the way, bad boards are not filled with bad people. They're just, it's just a bad situation. This particular individual was great. He was very talented, but didn't have time for this board and frankly didn't have a lot of interest in it. So really didn't understand the business, didn't come to half of the meetings because he was always overbooked. You know, it's very disruptive to the board, and it's difficult when you have people dropping in and out. You know, they almost do, they don't mean to, but they do drive-by shootings. You know, they come to the board meeting and they say, well, this is the answer. You need to lay people off, or you need to cut your expenses, or you need to do a brand campaign. And they really haven't been in all the conversations, so they don't really know what the right answer is, but they want to add value and they don't have much time. So that can really be disruptive to a board as well. The other thing is, be wary of making the board political or making your company political over the board. Once again, I had an experience on a board where every board member had put in a member of the senior team. So every one of the board members had a dog in the fight, right? They had somebody who reported to the CEO that was their guy. Well, that adds really weird dynamics in the board when you're trying to have discussion, especially if there's a performance problem somewhere, because you've got to be paying attention to, you know, who's got which dog in the fight, and it adds a political kind of overtone to things, and maybe some of the people who are your direct reports are getting information from board members that maybe you don't exactly want them to have at that certain time. Politics can really, it can just run roughshod over the culture of the board and the culture of the company. So just be careful careful about that. And what really is the problem with boards that aren't working is they take your time. So as a CEO, every hour you have to spend managing the board in terms of just kind of getting the board, herding cats, getting them to the right place, making sure everybody's aligned. You always have to do some of that. But if you have to spend too much time doing it, then that's time you're not spending on your company. And so you just really need to think about that. And once again, if things go bad, then you've really got a problem if you don't have a board that's aligned. So what does the board need from you, the entrepreneur or the CEO? If I could have filled the slide with one word, it would have been transparency. Don't just tell the board what you have to. Be open with your board. If you've gotten the right people on, they support you, they challenge you, but they're there for you, they're invested in your success. They can't help you if they don't know what the issues are. When I was running Drugstore, we had some real ups and downs, and we had a partner who, and I won't bore you with all the details, but the partner didn't deliver on something they were supposed to, and it was an incredibly visible partner. And the day that the street found out the partner wasn't going to deliver, we lost 70% of our market cap. 70%. Now, that was kind of a bad day as a CEO, let me tell you. And I called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon, and I had many investors who were calling for my head. And I got the board on the phone, and what they said to me is, look, you've kept us informed every step of the way. We've known about this. We knew the risks we took. We knew the deal we struck. We knew that there was a chance this was happening. You know, it's too bad. You got to go fix it. But just get back to work. Ignore the noise. We've got your back. We're behind you. That happens when you have kept your board informed, when you've told them about the risks, when you've got them in the foxhole with you, when you've been open, when you tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly. If you just tell them the minimum you can, they can't help you when you get into problems. And I don't know of any company, no matter how successful, that hasn't had ups and downs and problems on the way. So you have to be honest about what the risks are. You have to be honest about what's not going well, and you have to be honest about what maybe you think you're not good at that you need help with. Some of the questions I get is, when do you add an independent board member, especially for companies that maybe are raising institutional money, so they obviously get board members along with the institutional money they raise. It's so situational, but I would urge you to think about adding independent board members sooner rather than later. I think the operational experience can be very helpful. People who have had to build cultures, hire and fire, build a team, worry about execution, and once again, not that institutional or investors aren't sensitive to that, don't have that experience. There are many VCs who have that experience. But I just think having that experience and having an independent board member just can be helpful to you, especially in a situation where you're selling the company. Sometimes having somebody, you know, when you're selling the company, everybody has a role to play. The VCs have a very specific role that and these are wonderful people who are supportive, who love the company, love the CEO, but they have to look out for their limited partners. That's part of what they need to do. Sometimes as a CEO, it's very bittersweet to sell your company. You are feeling, you know, God, I need to sell it. It's the right thing. It's the right thing for the employees, but gee, it feels really bad, or I'm not quite sure about this. Having an independent board member can be somebody that you can talk to as a CEO, because they really, once again, don't have a dog in the fight. They don't necessarily have LPs they're looking out for, so they can be helpful and offer a helpful perspective in that process. I loved being a CEO, I have to say. I think it's one of the best jobs. It also, though, is stressful. It's lonely. And if you do it right, I think it takes enormous, enormous resilience and self-reflection. So I also think it's one of the most exciting things you can do. I don't think it gets any better than building a company or building something with really, really smart, committed people. But I think that is why the board is so important, because the CEO's job is so challenging. Because even though it's not a marriage, it is a really important, long relationship. And if you choose your board wisely, for people who push you, believe in you, challenge you, and support you, you know, I mean, it sounds corny, but when it works really well, it's almost magic. It's magic for the CEO, and it's magic for the board members. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to work with somebody to build something great, to change the world, to build a great company. So it's a great opportunity. I would say take advantage of it. Thanks very much.